Well, hi guys. I'm sitting in the National Radio Centre with Martyn Baker from the RSGB. Martyn is the kind of the boss.
Coordinator, yes, NRC coordinator.
I'd have put you as the boss, but there you go. Martyn, what's your call sign? And give us a little bit about yourself.
Okay, thanks indeed. The call sign is G0GMB. I've been that for a number of years now, but I did actually start life as G8KGF. I took my license when I was 21 at university, and before that I was an enthusiastic listener, and in fact when I started off I was A7077, going back quite a few years now. So I've been into amateur radio for about 50 years, I should think, and I was introduced by my uncle who lived down in the Harrow area. He was G3 HBR, Brian Hummerstone, and he was the guy that got me interested in amateur radio in the first place.
So you've got a long history of being involved with amateur radio. You must have seen some changes over the years, haven't you?
Well, indeed, of course, as a G8, I was operating on 2 meters to start with an old Pi taxiphone that was phase modulated, and got myself a line or two to move up to SSB, and from there kind of progressed onwards. I've always had a soft spot for a 2 meter operation, and although I'm quite happy to chat locally, I am much more of an SSB or a CW person and prefer to be chasing the DX. Yeah, I'm kind of Meteor, Scatter, Aurora, Tropo, and of course the ultimate sporadic E for those long distance QSOs.
Yeah, it sounds like it keeps you really busy. How do you find the time to fit all that in?
Well, yes, you could ask the wife that. That's a good question. Well, the role here at the NRC is effectively 3 days a week, but it actually takes up quite a lot more time than that, because we're open 6 days a week now. Through the summer it's been 7 days a week, and working with a team of about 35 volunteers, it means there's a lot of coordination to do with the rota, and of course, like any exhibition or museum, there's a lot of maintenance and ongoing work to make sure the centre's in good condition for the visiting public. So yeah, it's quite a busy role, and if I'm honest with you, since I've taken on the role, which I started in January of this year for the RSGB, what I've been able to achieve at home is very much reduced, because you kind of get back and you really don't want to be doing the day job when you get home in the evening. But overall, it's I'm managing to fit it all in, and it's a very enjoyable role altogether.
Yeah, well, I can see some quite phenomenal changes in the last year and improvements. So, you're obviously doing a great job here. And, I've seen lots of people wandering in and out today. 90% of them are probably not amateurs or never going to be amateurs. But it's nice to promote our hobby, and your volunteers do a really great job of that.
Well, of course, the volunteer team is absolutely core to having a good exhibition and museum that's open. And one of the things we do here is we pride ourselves on the interaction of the volunteers, so that they're engaging with the public as they walk through. And you're right, a lot of the people who pass through the centre here come to the NRC because they are visiting Bletchley Park and have little or no knowledge of amateur radio as a hobby, or as an enthusiast or anything along those lines, but they go out having appreciated radio and amateur radio so much more. I mean, we are typically in the summer, we are seeing between 300-400 visitors every day. In August, and it's not quite the end of the month, but we will have had over 9,000 visitors through the NRC just this month. Last year we had 26,000 visitors in the year. I think we will exceed that way beyond that this year. And that's really come about by working closely with Bletchley Park and improving the signage that we've got here, so that we're getting a higher percentage of footfall of visitors. And the ability to demonstrate and introduce amateur radio as a hobby to such a number of people is such a great opportunity.
Certainly is, and working with Bletchley Park, as you've said, I must admit, when we arrived at the main gate and said we were coming to see you, they certainly knew who you were and where to find you, and gave us directions to make our way over here. So, if somebody on the front gate knows where the National Radio Centre is, that's got to be a good move, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think it's important to work with all levels. If you're in an organisation, you've got to work with all levels. That means the senior management, the middle management, and all the everyday staff. And I would like to think that we get on as well with the catering and the security and the cleaning staff as well as we do with the top management here. And I think by doing that, that helps set a scene and a precedent.
Yeah, well, it does seem one big happy family on site, in fairness, and that's the way to go forward. Now, when we were talking earlier, before we got the gear out, you were telling us that you felt that the bit that everybody knows about with Bletchley Park is the code breaking, but you said that you described it as a triangle, which I thought was quite an interesting way of discussing it, how radio fitted in. So I wonder if you'd tell our listeners how you described it to me.
Yes, certainly. Well, in the reception area of the NRC, we've tried to set up some degree of continuity. If you think that 90% of our visitors come through the door because they've come to Bletchley Park, they're expecting to see something relevant to Bletchley Park. And really, of course, wireless is the key for that, because Bletchley Park, apart from a very short period of time in the war, didn't have any radio stations here. It was all about the decoding the messages, and if there had been wireless stations here, the aerials or the transmissions would have given away the secrecy of the place. So in the reception area, we have a number of Second World War receivers, CR100, AR88, HRO, and we try and set the scene about wireless and the importance of it to Bletchley Park, because if there were no messages or transmissions received, there would have been nothing sent to Bletchley Park to be decoded. And then, having decoded the messages and having analysed the military intelligence, that military intelligence had to be got out to the field, to the commanders, the Allied commanders, to act upon, and that again entailed wireless to get the messages out. So it really was a triage of activity, of which Bletchley Park was obviously the core. It was the breaking of the codes, but without the initial messages and without the ultra intelligence getting out, there would have been nothing happening.
Yeah, and the radio operators, let's be honest about it, the radio operators would have had to have been very accurate on what they were recording, because it was in code, so you couldn't read it. You couldn't say, oh, well, actually that word means this because I've got that character wrong. So if their accuracy had to be paramount, I would suggest.
Yes, indeed. And of course, I wasn't around in the time, but this is what we're hearing. I mean, there were two groups of people who were primarily involved in the reception of the messages that came to Bletchley Park. Initially, there were the military wireless intercept stations, which were manned by military personnel and by GPO staff, and they were predominantly listening for the military traffic in occupied Europe. But then there was this huge worry that there were agents or spies being dropped into Britain who would have been using low-power communication equipment to get that information back to their commanders. And that's where the voluntary interceptors were brought in through Lord Sandhurst, through the RSGB, to become the ears around the country. Because if those operators were using 5 to say 20 watts and they were on kind of 5 to 7 megahertz, the ground wave was very limited around there, so they needed multiple operators listening out for enemy transmissions. And these voluntary interceptors, who were initially part of MI8, became MI5 because they were listening internally in the country. But then, once they determined that there were no spies left in Britain that had been dropped in, they were then the voluntary interceptors were asked to listen for the Secret Service messages in occupied Europe, and hence became part of MI6, listening externally to the country. And these voluntary interceptors, their core office was based at Hounslow Park, which is now, of course, Hounslow Park, the Diplomatic Wireless Service. So really, the work of the voluntary interceptors was the foundation for Hounslow Park as we know it today.
Yeah, well, that sounds very interesting. Now, just a quickie, and you may not know this, do any of the ex-wireless operators from those years come back and see Bletchley Park and pop in here?
Yes, the answer is yes. There is a reunion of Bletchley Park veterans, whether that is just code breakers or operators or wrens or whatever, I don't really know, but there is a reunion that happens once a year, and there is also a reunion of the voluntary interceptors that happens once a year. To be honest, there are not many of them left now. Bob King is one of the guys, Pete Windle is another, and they come up here each year, and I was at that reunion a couple of months ago. So the numbers of actual VIs has dwindled a lot, but there is an enthusiastic following of sons or daughters who want to continue the involvement of them. So yes, there are reunions here.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting, and as you say, we're a long time in now. You know, they must be well in their 80s and 90s, I would suggest. So, it would be, obviously a lot of people will have passed on, unfortunately, but it's interesting.
So, yeah, I mean, I think the guys that we do see are kind of mid-90s now. So, yes, and of course, even if they're still with us, it becomes harder to walk and get around and whatever. So, the numbers are dwindling that come to the reunions.
Yeah. Well, I've wandered around today, and I must congratulate you on, the displays here. They are very, very interesting. I spoke to the guy operating the rig in there, and Simone from the RSGB headquarters is here as well. It's been a great day for us. Have you got any plans going forward? With anything going to happen here in Bletchley Park?
Well, there's obviously a lot of things that need to be considered. As I mentioned earlier on, I've only been on board since January, and in that time we've tried to make repairs to equipment which has degraded over the years. We've put in a new low-frequency aerial, low-frequency top band through to 10-metre fan dipole. We're having the tower that supports the stepper IR beam, we're having that renovated with new guy wires and footing improvements. We've added FT8 and some new, we've had an IT refresh with some new PCs. So there's been a lot of kind of bringing things up to speed. Once the house is in full order, then that's the time to think about how we take the NRC forward. And there are some thoughts about the future zone, because that was the future zone 6 years ago when the centre opened, but of course SDR, software-defined radio, is now in pretty much everyday use, and that's an area which personally I would like to see changed into an engagement zone. But obviously any changes that happen have to be thought through, the design has to be right, making it suitable for people with disabled people, to try and make sure that it looks very professional. And also, of course, if we're going to make changes, it's got to be done in a way that's going to last for a number of years. So it's got to be thought through carefully, and that means good design, it means good investment in whatever we decide to put in there. So that's something that's got to be decided by the RSGB board. It's good enough to have concepts, but it's got to be approved by the board before any changes are made.
Yeah, well, I can understand that. And in fairness, this is a great location. The access is great because you're straight in on the floor, so you've got wheelchair access. There's no ramps inside the building, so there's no real excuse why somebody can't come. It is a really good building on this one, and you do well.
Thank you. I mean, this just taking that idea of the future zone and the redevelopment of my ideal there is it becomes an engagement zone, because one of the things I'd like to introduce here is how people can get best involved in the hobby. You know, to be able to display some starter kits, some low-cost radios, some second-hand radios. My saying is a very simple one. If your 17-year-old son just passed his driving test, you wouldn't be taking him to the Lamborghini, the Ferrari or the Aston Martin garage. You'd be taking him down to look at Seats or Ford Focuses or Ford Fiestas or something of that nature. So it's absolutely brilliant that the manufacturers and the major retailers provide us with top-of-the-range kit here, such as the Flex or the Yaesu FT5000 or the Kenwood TS2000. It's absolutely great that they provide us with top-of-the-range kit, but I think it's imperative that we show how people can get started in the hobby without necessarily spending a fortune.
Yeah, well, actually, you've just hit a nail on one of my hobby horses there. In fairness, mine is that I've seen so many special event stations where you've got a couple of old boys sitting behind a radio with a back to the public, running radios that cost thousands of pounds. And if you're a parent and little Johnny says, "Dad, I want to do that," you're looking at it going, "Oh, your attention span's probably about 2 months, so I'm not spending that amount of money to do that." So kind of, yeah, older or cheaper or, you know, some of the more effective stuff. And I know people get very upset about things like Belfangs and that, but they are cost effective to getting people into the hobby. I don't know what you think on that one.
Well, I'm not particularly familiar with that particular radio, but what I can say is that we've introduced some second-hand radios into an area in the radio room now, specifically so that people can get some hands-on, have a tune up and down the band. And these have been kindly donated through Silent Keys, through families that where maybe the father or the husband has passed away, and they've offered the equipment to the National Radio Centre. Sometimes we can accept it, sometimes we can't, but what we're trying to do is to get more hands-on experience for people, because, you know, you can go into so many museums where it's look at displays, read this, see that, but, you know, it's the practical, getting your hands on, that I find inspires people if they want to take up something interesting.
Yeah, well, as I say, I was saying to Simone about your current displays in that there are knobs and buttons to push, which is what I remember the Science Museum used to be. But the Science Museum now is just all touchscreen, and that just left me cold. And being able to tune a radio in, I mean, I would guess that a lot of youngsters, people under the age of 20, have never done it, because it's all push button or it's all VHF FM transmission in the car. That's pretty much all they've ever done, I would suggest.
Well, I think you're right there, and of course that's an increasing tendency, isn't it? So the fun of tuning and through the crackle and the pop and the whistle and hearing a station that's coming in from the Far East or from the Middle East or South America, I think is really still quite special and helps to capture the imagination of people. And one of the aspects that we've really tried to introduce here is that amateur radio is no longer somebody just sitting in front of a box with a microphone and talking. You know, now we've got computers, we've got the internet, and we try in the NRC to show that it's an integrated hobby so that it makes it relevant to young people as well. It shows that the computers, the internet is involved, and you start looking at things like DX maps, solar ham, the live feed from the International Space Station, whether it's KST chat, you know, these are all tools that enable the hobby to work and make it so much more seamless in the modern world, I think.
Yeah, and the last thing is it has to be fun. And our hobby's so big now that, there's something in it for everybody, I would suggest.
Well, yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, whether you're looking from, the real high-end extremes of, say, EME work, right, through your mobile operations and your islands on the air or lighthouses on the air or de-expeditions. I mean, there are so many different aspects. And whilst we as kind of long-standing radio amateurs are perhaps more HF or DX orientated, we have to remember many people these days get into the hobby through things like D-Star or DMR or handheld rigs and the local repeaters. So it's very, very broad, and it's something for everybody, I'm sure.
It certainly is. Well, Martyn, I've kept you a lot of your time here and put you on the spot a bit occasionally, but anything else you'd like to tell us before we wind this up?
Well, naturally, we're grateful to you guys for coming in today and for helping to promote the NRC. And naturally, of course, the RSGB are very grateful, and we're grateful to them for having such a centre here. Obviously, it costs money to run the centre. The volunteers, we've got to say about 30 volunteers that come in, and they make a happy and enthusiastic team, and I hope that shows through the experience of the visitor. You've only got to look in our visitor book to see some of the comments, and you will see that they're pretty impressed, and that's the way I like it.
Well, that's great news. Well, listen, Martyn, thanks very much for your time. I wish you every success here running the centre, and I should probably be back in at least once more. Probably every year I tend to come here, so I'll probably see you again next time.
That's great. Thanks very much indeed. It's been a pleasure having you.